the cabin frequency.
I used to think solitude was something simple, just a matter of being alone in a quiet place. But solitude doesn't actually mean quiet, not really. Solitude means the mind starts replaying things it usually doesn't have time to process. It means every creak of an old cabin floorboard feels like a breath behind your neck. It means you notice the things you were never supposed to notice. That's what the winter of 1993 taught me up in the monitoring cabin near the Canadian border, where the national forest stretches for miles in every direction. A place so quiet that even the wind seems to whisper for company. A place so cut off that when something speaks back from the darkness, you know it isn't human. I took the job because I needed distance from people, from everything, including myself. I'd recently left the Forest Service after a particularly bad season, a series of search and rescue calls that ended in more recoveries than rescues. My supervisor said time alone at the storm tracking outpost would reset me. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he just wanted me someplace where I couldn't cause trouble. The cabin had been built decades earlier, a squat wooden structure perched on a ridge that oversaw a valley prone to avalanches and violent winter storms. The job was simple: monitor the atmospheric sensors, send twice daily radio updates, and stay inside when the weather turned vicious. They didn't tell me much about the previous operator other than he left suddenly and without a replacement lined up. The way they talked about him made me believe he wasn't fired, he just left. The snow was already knee-deep when the snowcat dropped me off. I remember the sound of its engine slowly fading, the crunch of tracks disappearing into the distance, until the white forest swallowed every trace of the world I had just come from. There was an odd comfort knowing I was now cut off entirely, like the world had given me permission to stop trying so damn hard to be part of it. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. One room that doubled as a living space and workstation, a cot in the corner, and a short hallway leading to a cramped supply room. But it was warm enough once the stove got going, and the radio console took up nearly an entire wall, lined with knobs, dials, and switches whose purposes I pretended to know. The first few days were uneventful. I checked atmospheric readings, filled out logs, radioed in my weather reports at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., and spent the remaining hours reading old field manuals and listening to the wind moan through the frost-thickened pines. At night, the temperature dropped so low that the windows sang, tiny popping sounds as the glass contracted against its frame. I didn't mind; those were natural sounds, the ordinary voice of winter. What bothered me was the other sound. It started sometime around midnight on my third night. Just a faint whisper of static from the radio console, even though it was powered down. At first, I thought the storm outside was creating interference, but the air was dead still that night. No wind, no snowfall, just a restless hum crawling out of the speaker the way an animal might claw at the walls of its cage. I turned the console on, checked the frequency dial, adjusted the gain, and tried to track the origin of the noise, but it was on no channel. It wasn't anything I'd heard from a radio before. The static wasn't random, it pulsed, rising and falling in a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like breathing. I told myself it was atmospheric interference. It had to be. Weird things happen to radio signals in cold air. Or at least that's what I kept repeating as I lay in my cot with the blankets pulled up to my chin, listening to that faint, steady exhale coming from a machine that wasn't even powered on. The next morning it was gone, and I laughed at myself for being paranoid. But paranoia has a scent, a texture, a way of lingering like the smell of extinguished matches after a candle flame dies. As I ate breakfast, instant oatmeal, lukewarm coffee, the silence in the cabin felt unnatural, like the place was holding its breath. I checked the radio again out of habit, scanning the local frequencies, listening for feedback. Everything was normal, or seemed normal. The static didn't return that night or the night after. For a moment, I convinced myself that the cabin had merely been settling, that the cold had seeped too deep into the wiring. But winter up there has a way of turning days into endless stretches of white noise. There's no rhythm to mark time, no sun to follow in the sky, just a pale smear behind clouds that never lift. By the start of the second week, I found myself talking out loud just to hear something human, reading my logs in a half-whisper, humming while I cooked, muttering to myself while stoking the fire. That's when the radio whispered back. It happened while I was mid-sentence recording the evening atmospheric log. The frequency meter flickered for the briefest moment, and underneath my own voice I heard it. A whisper so faint I thought it had come from inside my own head. "Don't!" I froze. My hand hovered over the recording button. The hairs on my arms lifted one by one. I replayed the tape twice, leaning closer each time, pressing the headphones tight around my ears, listening for any flaw or distortion that could explain what I thought I heard. Nothing. Just my own voice and the low hiss of background noise. I told myself my brain had filled in the gaps, that isolation was starting to have its way with me. But that night, the whisper returned. Not a fragment this time, not a breath, but a voice that knew my name. It was around 1:14 in the morning. I remember because the cabin had an old battery-powered clock nailed above the stove, and I had just settled into my cot. The wind had begun to pick up, brushing cold fingers against the window frame. I was drifting towards sleep when the radio console clicked. It wasn't loud, just a soft mechanical tick, the sound a switch might make if someone gently nudged it. I opened my eyes. At first I didn't move. For a moment I wasn't even afraid. I was annoyed, convinced the wiring was shorting again. But then the static rose, slowly, steadily, like something inhaling through clenched teeth, not the random pop and crackle of interference. This was controlled, intentional. The hairs along my jawline prickled. Then it spoke. "Mark." My name, drawn out, frayed at the edges, warped like someone speaking underwater. My heart slammed once against my ribs so hard I felt nauseous. I sat up, blankets tangled around my legs, staring at the dark outline of the console. The power switch was still off. Every light on the board was dead, but the voice continued. "Mark, can you hear me?" The way it said my name wasn't human. Humans put emotion into speech, even when whispering, frustration, urgency, fatigue. This voice had none of that. It was flat, empty, like something imitating a person without understanding why names mattered at all. I didn't answer, couldn't. My throat felt full of ice. "You awake?" The voice had a slight delay to it, like a misaligned recording. "I've been trying to reach you." Every instinct in my body screamed not to move, not to breathe, not to respond. I felt childish for believing staying still would protect me, but fear isn't rational. Fear is ancient. The voice exhaled, a long scraping hiss that sounded too close, too real. "I see you." That snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted upright and lunged for the console, slamming my palm against the power switch. The lights blinked on. The static vanished, and for a long minute I stood there, hand trembling, waiting for something, anything to come through. But the radio was silent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time the building creaked or the wind shifted, I twisted toward the sound like a trapped animal. When dawn finally arrived, weak and gray, I approached the console again, scanning the frequencies mechanically. Nothing unusual, no interference, no unidentified transmissions. I checked the wiring, opened the panel, tested the grounding, all normal. By mid-afternoon, I convinced myself I had dreamed it. Stress had manifested as auditory hallucination. The human mind breaks in strange ways. But denial is fragile. That evening, after I radioed in the standard snowpack measurements, I heard something new. Not a voice, not yet, but something beneath the static. 3 soft tones rising in sequence, repeating every 15 seconds. They were too pure to be natural atmospheric noise, too consistent to be interference. I recorded them, played them back through headphones, tried mapping the waveform. The pattern didn't match any known emergency beacon or communication signal used in our district. At 2 a.m., the tones changed, not randomly, deliberately. They shifted into 5 ascending notes, then paused, then 5 descending notes, repeating in an endless loop like a greeting ritual or a test. Every time the notes rose, I felt a crawling sensation across the back of my skull, a pressure behind my eyes as if the frequency itself was prodding my brain. That's when the voice slipped through again, woven into the pauses between the tones.
Mark, why won't you answer me?
This time something in the voice had evolved. It sounded slightly more articulate, as though it had learned something new since the last time it spoke. But the emptiness was still there. Emotionless mimicry trying to wear human language like a mask. I grabbed my parka and stepped outside into the sub-zero night, desperate to get away from the sound even if it meant freezing. But as soon as I opened the door, the wind carried something through the trees. A faint echo of the same rising tones, stretched and distorted as though the forest itself were humming back the signal. My breath fogged in front of me as I backed toward the cabin, heart rattling in my chest. The tones followed, drifting through the valley, bouncing off snow-laden branches, growing clearer with every passing second. Then the voice called out again, but this time, it didn't come from the radio. It came from the woods. A whisper threaded through the dark pines.
I see you.
I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though locks don't stop the kind of thing I was dealing with. The tones continued for another hour before finally dissolving back into ordinary static. I sat at the workstation long after that, staring at the console, trying to steady my breathing. The worst part, the voice hadn't sounded angry or threatening. It had sounded patient, as though it knew I would answer eventually, as though it had all the time in the world to wait for me. Sleep became a luxury after that night. Every time I tried to drift off, my mind replayed the rising tones echoing across the valley, the way they harmonized with the wind as though the land itself were repeating them. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't just hearing the signal. It was broadcasting it, amplifying it, drawing whatever was out there closer. The snowstorm that rolled through the next morning should have comforted me. The brutal wind and heavy snowfall meant no one, nothing could move through the forest without leaving some sign. But the storm didn't bury tracks that night, because there were never any tracks to bury. Nothing physical was approaching the cabin. Whatever hunted me through the radio waves didn't need to touch the ground. By noon, the storm had settled into a whiteout. The sky blended seamlessly with the earth, erasing the horizon. I checked the sensors, radioed in my report, and tried to ignore how the static beneath my own broadcast sounded like breathing again. My supervisor on the other end didn't notice anything. He never did. I thought about telling him what was happening, but what would I say? Hey, the void keeps whispering my name every night. Can I take a personal day? I already had a reputation for stress-related issues after the search and rescue season that nearly broke me. A complaint like that would brand me as unstable at best, delusional at worst. But I wasn't delusional. Something was trying to talk to me. That evening, after forcing down a meal of powdered soup and crackers, I sat at the console again and monitored the frequencies out of obligation, pretending not to flinch whenever the static swelled. For the first time in days, the tones didn't return, but silence is never reassuring in a place where sound has become a warning. I adjusted a few knobs, switching through bands the cabin rarely used, half expecting the voice to slither through at any moment. When it didn't, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the frost crawling up the window glass. That's when I saw it and something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shifting shadow, a snow-laden branch bending under its own weight. But branches don't stand upright and shadows don't turn. The figure stood maybe 30 yards from the cabin, tall and narrow, like a person stretched just slightly too long. The snow fell around it but never landed on it, as though it existed half a breath out of sync with the world. My stomach dropped. I blinked once, twice. The shape didn't vanish. It lifted its head, and the radio blared to life behind me.
Mark, let me in.
The voice was clearer now, calmer, almost soothing. I staggered back, knocking over my chair as the console lights flickered even though the machine was still off. The static roared, building into a rising wail, and the thing outside began to move, jerking forward one lurching step at a time. The moment its foot touched the snow, the tone from the radio changed. 5 rapid pulses, then a low, droning hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The thing froze, as if something had commanded it to stop. I stared between the figure and the console, breath sharp and uneven. The radio wasn't communicating with me anymore. It was communicating with it. When the hum died, the creature dissolved back into the storm, fading like smoke caught in a sudden downdraft, swallowed by the snow as though it had never been there at all. I stood there for minutes, maybe hours, too afraid to move. When I finally regained my voice, it was barely a whisper. "What the hell are you?" The radio answered, but not in English. A burst of guttural sound spilled through the speakers. Clicks, growls, something like a distorted mimicry of speech. And beneath it all, a faint rhythm I recognized instantly. Breathing, but not mine. I cut the power to the console, unplugged it, yanked every cable I could find. The static persisted. The voice persisted. The cabin felt too small, too close, like the walls were closing in around me, carrying the vibrations of the creature's breath through their wooden ribs. Only when I shoved the entire console off the desk did the sound finally stop, cutting out mid-word like a severed cord. Silence fell over the cabin again. Not comforting silence, not natural silence, a silence shaped like hunger. For the next 24 hours, I kept every lantern lit, every window shuttered. I slept in short, trembling micro-dreams, jolting awake each time I heard the pop of ice expanding outside or the rustle of wind across the roof shingles. The dismantled radio console lay in a heap near the supply room door, a gutted carcass that still seemed to radiate a faint humming warmth, like an engine cooling after a long, violent drive. I told myself the nightmare was over. The connection broken, the creature gone, but the cabin had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the pressure outside had dropped even though the weather stayed clear. My breath fogged indoors. I could see it drifting in front of me even with the stove burning at full intensity, and the snow outside the windows seemed wrong. Too still. Not drifting, not melting, not even shifting beneath the weight of the wind. Like the valley itself was holding its breath. Around noon, while chewing through a tasteless protein bar, I heard footsteps on the snow outside. Slow, dragging footsteps. I froze, eyes locked on the front door. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice. each step pausing just long enough between motions to make the hair on my neck stand straight. No voice accompanied them, no tones, just movement, intentional, observant. I grabbed my hatchet from the wall, gripping the handle so hard my palms went numb, and crept toward the window. I lifted the edge of the shutter, peering through the narrow gap. Nothing, no tracks, no figure, no disturbance in the snow at all. The footsteps continued anyway. Right behind me, I spun around, hatchet raised, heart hammering, but the cabin was empty. The air was freezing now, cold enough that frost had begun to form on the interior of the tin stovepipe. The footsteps kept circling, now inside, now outside, now somewhere in the walls, like something was tracing the perimeter of my fear, mapping it out. Then the whisper returned. Not from the radio this time. From the cabin itself.
You're listening, aren't you?
The voice came from everywhere at once. Floorboards, windows, the metal frame of my cot. The entire structure had become a speaker. I've been waiting, Mark, waiting for you to hear me. I slammed my hands over my ears, but the voice wasn't in my ears. It was inside my skull, vibrating against bone.
You are the only one who listens.
My knees buckled. I fell to the floor, trying to quiet my breathing, trying to stay rational even as my rational mind broke apart like ice under a truck tire. The voice wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, it was lonely. Something about that terrified me more than anything else. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't malicious by instinct. It was desperate. Desperate enough to mimic human speech. Desperate enough to wander the forest in a borrowed shape. Desperate enough to reach through frequencies it shouldn't understand. Desperate enough to find me. I crawled toward the console wreckage, not because I thought I could fix it, but because I needed to see it broken. Needed to know the connection was truly severed. The metal casing was warped. The internal wiring melted in places as if it had been exposed to extreme heat. And buried deep inside the ruined machine was something I couldn't explain. A black, stone-like fragment no bigger than a thumb, smooth and warm to the touch, humming faintly with rhythmic pulses that mirrored the tones I'd heard the night before. I dropped it instantly. The cabin inhaled around me, and not wind, not settling wood. A deliberate, slow inhale.
Don't leave me, Mark.
My name. Clearer than ever. I backed away from the wreckage, heart pounding in my throat. The voice tracked my movement, growing quieter as I retreated, louder when I hesitated.
You're the only one who stayed.
That sentence lodged deep inside me. The previous operator hadn't left due to stress. He hadn't left due to weather. He had run. He heard this thing too. And he abandoned the cabin because he refused to listen to it anymore. The realization hit me with a clarity so sharp it bordered on pain. This thing had waited months, maybe years, waiting for someone else to arrive, waiting for someone to replace him, and waiting for me. By dusk, I had packed my gear, food, lanterns, extra layers, flare gun, every necessity for a long trek through winter wilderness. The storm had cleared that afternoon, leaving a path of bright moonlight across the valley. If there was ever a chance to escape, it was now. I couldn't stay in that cabin another night. I couldn't let that voice learn anything else from me. But the moment I reached for the doorknob, the cabin spoke again. Not with words, but with memories. A sound rose behind me, soft, broken sobbing. A voice I hadn't heard in nearly a year. My sister's voice. The voice from the day we found her son's body out near the ravine after he got lost in the storm. A tragedy I had been part of. A tragedy I still carried like a stone in my chest.
Why didn't you find him sooner, Mark?
I froze. That wasn't her. That wasn't real, but the cabin echoed with her grief, imitated perfectly down to the crack in her breath, the trembling in her throat. I turned slowly. The supply room door was open a crack. Light flickered inside the room, lantern light, even though I hadn't lit a lantern in there. The sobbing continued, soft and rhythmic, fading to a whimper that cut straight through me. My fingers tightened around my hatchet, but I couldn't move. The sounds throbbed with emotional accuracy, like something peeling open an old wound to pull me back.
You left him. You left him out there.
I pressed my back against the cold cabin wall, eyes burning. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was playing me. But grief doesn't care about logic. The voice shifted again, this time to my nephew's voice, small, frightened.
Uncle Mark, why didn't you come find me?
That did it. I cracked. I kicked the supply room door open with a roar of desperation, the hatchet raised, lantern glow slicing through the darkness. The room was empty, completely empty. The voice stopped instantly. What replaced it was worse. A slow, deliberate knock from the cabin wall closest to my head. 3 knocks, pause. 3 more, then a voice. My voice, unmistakable, speaking from behind the wall as though another version of me was trapped on the other side. Mark, don't go out there. I stumbled back so hard I slammed into the shelving unit, knocking supplies to the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just imitating voices, it was learning them, replaying them, using them like a parasite adapting to its host. Stay with me, the voice whispered. I can be you, and you can be me. That sentence chilled me more than the cold ever could. Something scratched inside the walls. Something moved with wet, slithering motions, tracing pathways through the cabin's structure. The lantern flickered violently, frost crawled across the ceiling beams. I lunged for the door and froze. The doorknob was vibrating, shaking as though someone on the other side was gripping it, turning it slowly, testing the lock. The whisper returned, now so close it brushed the back of my ear. You're listening? Good. The door latch clicked. I wrenched the latch up and threw my entire weight against the door, forcing it shut again. The thing on the other side responded with a low, resonant growl that sent vibrations through my boots. I jammed the backup deadbolt into place, then shoved the heavy supply crate against the door for extra reinforcement. The knocking intensified, turning into a pounding so violent that snow drifted off the rafters. Then, silence. A silence so sudden and absolute it made me dizzy. My breath came in white puffs. I backed away from the door, hatchet trembling in my grip. Another sound rose in the room. A faint whisper of static, not from the destroyed console, from inside the walls. I stumbled toward the center of the cabin, every muscle coiled tight, eyes wide. The static deepened, grew layered and thick like 100 distant voices whispering all at once just beyond comprehension. The walls themselves vibrated with it. Then the voice, the original voice, cut through clean and soft.
Open the door. I found a new shape.
The doorknob began to twist again. This time, it succeeded. The latch clicked open, and something slid into the cabin, and not walked, not stepped, slid. A blur of unnatural motion, joints bending wrong, limbs too long, torso too thin, head swiveling in a slow, liquid arc like it was made of melted wax. Its skin was pale, not white, but colorless like moonlight carved into flesh. Its face. God, that face. It had none. Just a smooth plane of skin where features should be. Then slowly, impossibly, it pushed new features outward from within the skin, pressing and stretching until 2 eye sockets formed. A nose, a mouth, my face, another voice, my voice spilled from its mouth. See, I can be you now. I raised the hatchet and backed away. It tilted its head, mimicking my movement exactly down to the microsecond reflex of fear. Every motion I made, it mirrored, like a reflection stepping out of glass. "We can be the same," it whispered. "Stay back," I gasped. It took the same step backward and then forward and then sideways, testing, learning, and copying. The static grew louder, pouring in through the open door, swirling around us like a blizzard of invisible voices. The creature lunged. I swung the hatchet on instinct alone, burying the blade in its shoulder. The thing didn't scream. It didn't recoil. It simply paused, as if surprised, and then tilted its head again, studying the weapon buried in its flesh. No blood, just static. Static poured from the wound like smoke. I tore the hatchet free and ran. Not toward the door, toward the destroyed console, toward the black stone fragment, the thing's humming beacon, the object that tied it here. I grabbed the stone, felt its warmth pulse against my skin, and hurled it into the stove. The cabin reacted at once. The air imploded inward, pulling the heat out of the room, dragging the creature backward as though caught in an invisible wind. It collapsed onto the floor, limbs flailing in silent spasms, face melting back into that smooth, empty surface. The static grew deafening, rising to a pitch that felt like shards driving into my skull. The stove roared, the fire brightened, the stone cracked. The creature shrieked, not with sound but with pressure, a psychic scream that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. Then, in a burst of flame and smoke, the stone shattered completely. The static cut out. The creature dissolved, breaking apart into vapor, then particles, then nothing at all. I don't remember how long I lay on the floor afterward. Minutes, hours. The cabin felt dead, drained, the air thick and unmoving. When I finally crawled outside, dawn was breaking. The sky was pink and gold. The snow glittered like crushed diamonds. No tracks around the cabin and no signs of anything unnatural. Just me, alone again. I stumbled down the ridge, half frozen, half conscious, and eventually encountered a search party that had come looking after my missed daily reports. They told me I looked pale, shocked, malnourished. They asked if I had been hallucinating. I didn't answer, because as they loaded me into the rescue sled, I heard something faint. So faint I thought I imagined it. But I didn't imagine it. From the radio clipped to one of the Rangers' jackets. A rising sequence of tones, faint, patient, awaiting, 5 ascending notes and 5 descending, then a whisper.
Mark.
The quiet house at the edge of Grey Pine Road.
When I agreed to house sit for my aunt, I thought it would be easy money. She'd inherited an old property from some distant relative she barely remembered, a house sitting deep at the end of Grey Pine Road, a narrow gravel stretch swallowed by pine trees that creaked even when the wind was still.
Just check the pipes.
She told me over the phone.
Keep the lights on in the evening. Bring in the mail. It's only for 4 nights.
Easy. Simple. 4 nights alone in a quiet old house where the nearest neighbor lived half a mile away. I didn't mind. I liked solitude more than I liked people. What I didn't like, though, what I couldn't have known, was what silence could become when it was too complete, too unwavering, too absolute, to be natural. The house greeted me with stillness the moment I stepped inside. Not just silence. Stillness. The kind of hush that presses down on your shoulders and sinks into your throat. Thick and unnatural. I've spent time in old libraries, in empty churches, in abandoned campgrounds past dusk, but nothing compared to that first step into Grey Pine House. The air had a weight to it, as though sound was forbidden to enter. Even the hum of electricity felt suppressed, muffled to a nearly imperceptible whisper. My own footsteps sounded wrong, like I was hearing them from far away. The layout was simple but cramped. Narrow hallways, a staircase that turned twice before reaching the second floor, a living room filled with furniture older than my aunt. Everything, absolutely everything, smelled like dust, sealed inside glass. And yet nothing looked dirty. That was the strange part. The house was spotless, every surface polished, not a cobweb in a corner, not a speck of dirt on the floor. But it felt lived in, not recently, but consistently, as if someone had been maintaining it without actually being there. The first thing I did was walk through each room, just to familiarize myself. The living room had lace curtains that looked stiff enough to stand on their own. The dining room table was set for one. A single plate, a spoon, a fork, placed with obsessive precision. The plate was empty but spotless, reflecting the ceiling light like a mirror. Upstairs, the guest room where I'd be staying had a narrow bed pushed against the wall and an old radio on the dresser. An actual analog radio. Cream-colored plastic, the kind with a tuning dial big enough to grip with your whole hand. It wasn't plugged in. But the room that bothered me most was the one at the end of the upstairs hall, the sewing room. I only glanced inside the first time. A sewing machine sat near the window, an old iron and wood thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. Next to it was a mannequin torso on a wooden stand, covered in a half-finished dress of faded yellow fabric. I remember pausing, staring for a second too long, without knowing exactly why. Maybe it was the way the mannequin was angled. Not facing the sewing machine, not facing the door, but turned slightly as if mid-movement. Or maybe it was because the dress looked like someone had been stitching it that very morning. A threaded needle still hung from the fabric. Spools lay neatly lined on the small table beside it. A pin cushion sat perfectly centered like a tiny crown. Aunt Meredith didn't sew. I was sure of that. When I shut the door to the sewing room, the latch clicked so sharply that it made me jump. Echoes didn't travel far in the house. They just dissolved. By the time I finished bringing in my bag and settling into the guest room, the sun had already dipped behind the tree line. The shadows outside thickened into a deep, unnatural blue that reminded me of the few minutes after a power outage, when the world feels abruptly too still. I made myself a cup of tea in the kitchen. The water boiled surprisingly quick, and sat at the small table. I checked my phone. No service, not even a single bar. I wasn't surprised. My aunt had told me reception was terrible out there. Use the landline if you need anything, she'd said, though I hadn't noticed a phone yet. It wasn't until I'd finished half my tea that I realized something. The house was still too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. I lifted my glass, set it down. No ring of glass against wood. The refrigerator made no hum. The pipes made no groan. I'd spent years sleeping in old homes and knew the language of wood expanding at dusk. This place didn't speak at all. And then I heard it for the first time. A single, soft tap from upstairs. Then another. Slow, deliberate. A pause in between long enough to make me lean forward and hold my breath. Tap. I set my cup down carefully, listening. Maybe it was the house settling, but it didn't feel like that kind of sound. There was intention in it, a pattern, almost. Tap, tap, tap. After 30 seconds, the sound stopped. Not faded, stopped instantly, like it had been cut off mid-moment. I waited a full minute before standing. My legs felt stiff, like the air around me had thickened again. Slowly, I walked out to the base of the staircase and looked up. Darkness pooled at the top like ink. Hello? My voice sounded wrong, swallowed halfway down the hall before it even reached the stairs. Nothing answered. The quiet wrapped around everything again, suffocating and dense. I hesitated, hand on the banister, my fingers numb with unease. Then, before I could convince myself otherwise, I took a step up. The stairs didn't creak. Even my breathing felt too loud, like the house resented the intrusion of sound. When I reached the landing, something cold brushed past my ankle. A draft, I told myself instinctively, but the air wasn't moving. The stillness was absolute. And then I noticed the door to the sewing room. It was open. I knew I had closed it, firmly, hard enough that the latch clicked. The doorway yawned before me, a rectangle of soft darkness, and I felt something stir in the back of my mind, a wordless whisper of warning. The house didn't want noise, didn't want movement, but the sewing room looked different somehow. I stepped closer, heartbeat thudding in my throat. The mannequin was no longer angled the way it had been. It was facing the door, facing me, and the needle that had been hanging loose from the dress was now pressed all the way in, completing a stitch. Someone had been working. Someone had been inside. I took a step back, pulse hammering, eyes unable to pull away from that still, silent figure. The mannequin stood motionless, but everything about the room vibrated with something unseen, something watching, something waiting. Then the quiet broke again. A whisper, not a voice exactly, more like breath moving where breath shouldn't be, and it came from right beside my ear. I spun around so quickly that my heels slid on the old carpet, my hands smacking against the wall for balance. There was no one behind me, nothing but the dark hallway and the faint rectangular glow of the window at the far end. My skin prickled all the way up my neck. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremor in my breath. It must have been the house settling, I told myself. But the lie felt thin, flimsy, fragile. I backed away from the sewing room, step by cautious step. But the mannequin seemed to loom larger with every inch I put between us. Its blank porcelain face reflected the faint hallway light, featureless and yet somehow accusatory. When I finally reached the top of the stairs, I pivoted and walked down quickly, not running, not yet, but fast enough that my heartbeat thudded like a pulse inside my ears. By the time I got back to the kitchen, my tea had gone cold. I wrapped both hands around the mug anyway, just for the heat of it. I sat down at the table and pressed my forehead into my palms, forcing myself to breathe slowly, deeply, rationally. There was nothing up there. Nothing touched me. Nothing whispered. It was just nerves, just the creepiness of an old house I wasn't used to. That's all. But the silence around me, the oppressive silence, pressed in again, and I realized the house felt almost offended, like it resented my attempt to explain it away. I tried to distract myself for the next hour. I unpacked my bag, rifled through my aunt's old bookshelf, paced the small living room while flipping light switches just to hear something. But every sound I made seemed muted, dull, deadened. Even the crunch of a potato chip felt unnatural. Finally, unable to stand the feeling of being watched any longer, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside for air. The moment the door opened, sound flooded in, wind rustling through pine needles, loves scraping against gravel, a distant owl. Even my own exhale felt richer outside that house. I stood on the small porch, staring at the dark silhouette of the tree line against a starless sky. The moon was nothing but a faint smudge behind clouds. The air smelled like earth and resin. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I could breathe. I almost didn't go back inside. I could have driven home, left the lights burning and returned in the morning, but the thought felt wrong. like something wanted that lured me toward that choice. So I reluctantly returned, closing the door softly behind me. The silence slammed into me the moment the latch clicked. I nearly dropped my keys from the shock of it. Something in the air had changed. The house felt warmer, as if someone or something had been moving around recently. I turned to head toward the living room but froze the second I saw the radio. The old analog radio in the guest room upstairs. The one that wasn't plugged in now sat on the living room coffee table, centered perfectly, facing the couch. I hadn't touched it. I knew I hadn't. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I reached for it cautiously, pressing my fingers against the smooth plastic casing. It was warm. That made no sense. My first instinct was to get out, leave, walk straight out the door and never come back. But the moment I took a step backward, the radio clicked. Not loudly, just a tiny mechanical tick. The soft sound of a tuning dial shifting one notch. My mouth went dry. I stared at it, unsure if I should touch it again. Then with a soft hiss, the speaker crackled. Static, soft, low static. The only real sound the house had made since I arrived. Then the static began to rise. Faint at first, like a whisper buried inside the noise. A voice struggling to form. Shapes of syllables without clarity. I leaned in, straining to hear. The voice sharpened suddenly. A woman's voice. Distant, trembling.
Don't look at them.
My breath caught. I blinked, stunned, unsure if I'd heard correctly.
Don't look.
The static roared for a moment, drowning the voice, then cut off with a sharp pop. The radio went dead. I sat frozen, unable to process anything except the hammering of my own pulse. Don't look at them. My eyes drifted involuntarily to the staircase, to the closed door at the top, to the sewing room. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch with the lights on, staring at the radio until sunrise. At some point, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard faint footsteps above me. Soft, slow, pacing between rooms. I didn't move. Didn't dare. The steps continued for nearly 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence grew heavier afterward. The next morning, exhausted but determined, I decided to look for the landline phone. I found it in a hallway closet. A beige rotary model mounted to the wall. I picked it up. No dial tone, no hum, nothing. Of course. I slammed it back into the cradle harder than I meant to. You need to get out. The thought slammed into me as sharply as the silence, but something bitter inside me pushed back. No, I wasn't going to flee because an old house creaked weirdly and a radio whispered nonsense. People lived here. My aunt trusted me. I was not going to be driven out by fear. So I decided to explore, fully, every room, every drawer, every corner. If the house had a logical explanation, I would find it. That's when I discovered the basement. The door to it was behind a pantry cabinet that swung out like a false wall. I hadn't noticed it the night before, maybe because it had been too dark, or maybe because it hadn't been open enough to draw my eye. But that morning, the cabinet stood half open, inviting. The door behind it was slightly ajar, leading downward into absolute blackness. A cold draft rose up from below, carrying the faintest metallic scent. Blood? Rust? I couldn't tell. I stood there for a long moment, staring into that darkness. It seemed to breathe. I finally mustered the courage to grab the flashlight from the drawer and descend the narrow wooden stairs. The basement was larger than expected, long, wide, with low ceilings and stone walls that looked centuries old. My flashlight flickered over shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables, old tools, boxes of photo albums. There was nothing immediately sinister, but that metallic scent grew stronger the deeper I went. At the far end of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of crates, I found a sewing table. Not the one upstairs, a different one, older. Rusted needles scattered across its surface, spools unwound, scraps of fabric mottled with brown stains. And above the table, pinned neatly to the wall with long silver sewing pins, were photographs, hundreds of photographs. I stepped closer, breath catching. They were all of the same woman, a pale woman with dark hair and empty eyes. Each photo captured her in various stages of making the yellow dress I'd seen upstairs, the same dress still draped on the mannequin. In some photos, she smiled faintly. In others, her eyes looked hollow and sunken. And in the most recent ones, she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, figures stood, tall, thin, featureless shapes, their silhouettes etched with faint white outlines, like chalk on a black surface. They hovered behind her as she sewed, as she stood at the window, as she walked the halls. The last photo made my stomach lurch. The woman sat slumped over the sewing machine, head bowed, hair covering her face. Behind her stood a single tall figure, its hand resting gently on her shoulder. The hand was elongated, skeletal, with too many joints. My knees weakened. The flashlight trembled in my grip. That's when I heard movement behind me. Slow, careful footsteps, coming down the stairs. I froze, turning my head just enough to see the faint beam of daylight shrinking above as something ascended into the basement space. Then a whisper, soft, smooth, close.
You weren't supposed to see this.
I whipped around, but the flashlight flickered violently, then died. The basement plunged into pitch darkness, and the footsteps began to move faster. I bolted blindly, slamming my hip into a crate hard enough to knock it over. Glass shattered somewhere underfoot as I stumbled across the uneven floor, my hands outstretched, fingers grasping for anything familiar in the dark. I reached the far wall and followed it, heart hammering against my ribs so violently that it hurt. The footsteps behind me weren't fast, but they were deliberate, unhurried, as though whoever followed me didn't need to rush, as though they already knew where I would end up. As I reached the corner of the basement, the air grew colder, harsher. I stretched my hands out, palms scraping along stone, until I found what felt like another door. Wooden with iron hinges, I pushed. It didn't budge. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Not empty silence. Expectant silence. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts. I pushed harder on the door, feeling it strain but not open. Then something brushed against my ankle. Light, like fingertips grazing skin. I kicked instinctively and pressed myself against the farthest wall, chest heaving. I could hear them breathing now. Slow, deep breaths that didn't sound like lungs, more like air being pulled through hollow bone. Then I heard another sound, a faint mechanical click. The flashlight flickered back to life, only it wasn't in my hand anymore. It lay on the sewing table in the center of the room, perfectly upright, pointed straight at me. Its narrow beam illuminated something in the darkness, a figure standing between me and the stairs. Tall, too tall, limbs unnaturally long, skin stretched thinly over its frame, its head cocked one way, then the other, like it was studying me, It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. A mannequin. It was the shape of a mannequin. My stomach dropped as realization hit me. Upstairs. The sewing room? The mannequin wasn't the only one. It stepped toward me, each movement accompanied by a soft clicking sound, like wood bending under pressure. The air grew so cold I could see my breath. "Stay away." My voice cracked. The figure paused. Then its head twitched, a short, jerking motion, and something shifted behind me. I turned slowly. There, in the corner where the darkness pooled thickest, the woman from the photographs stood. Her eyes were sunken hollows, her shoulders slumped unnaturally low, as though her bones had softened or been rearranged. The yellow dress, the unfinished one, now clung to her body like wet fabric, sagging and torn. She opened her mouth. No sound came from her throat. But the house trembled. The silence cracked. And then, like a dam giving way, sound split through the basement. A deafening, shrill, metallic screech that made my hands fly to my ears. The mannequin lurched forward. The woman stepped closer, her feet dragging across the stone floor. I dropped to the ground and scrambled sideways, slipping between stacked crates. I crawled blindly, scraping knees and elbows on rough stone, until I spotted a thin line of light. The stairs. I lunged toward it. A hand, cold, impossibly cold, clamped around my ankle. I screamed and kicked, my heel striking something soft that gave with a sickening crack. The grip loosened and I tore free, sprinting toward the stairs so fast I nearly tripped. As I reached the bottom step, the flashlight flickered behind me, and in that split second of illumination, I saw them. Dozens. Dozens of mannequin-shaped figures rising from the dark, faces blank, limbs crooked, heads tilting in unnatural angles as they watched me escape. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the basement and slammed the cabinet door closed. I wedged the nearest chair against it and stumbled backward, gasping. The house remained silent, peaceful, as though nothing had happened. But the quiet felt hungry now. Alive. I staggered into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, body trembling uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run into the woods, to keep running until the house vanished behind the trees. I grabbed my car keys. That's when the front door opened by itself. Slowly, smoothly, quietly. Cold air swept in as the door held open, inviting me out. Escape? I didn't trust it. Not after the basement, not after what I saw. But staying felt impossible. I stepped cautiously toward the doorway, keys clenched so tightly in my fist that my knuckles ached. The open night stretched out before me, dark but natural normal. Real. I took one step across the threshold. The wind stopped. The trees stilled. Every sound around me died in an instant, like the world had been muted. The silence was no longer coming from the house. It followed me out. Before I could react, a soft whisper brushed the back of my neck.
You can't leave.
Hands, dozens of hands, clamped around my arms, legs, waist, dragging me backward into the house. I screamed, twisted, kicked, but the cold grip tightened. I fell onto the hardwood floor, fingernails scraping long streaks across the polished boards. The mannequin figures stood along the walls of the living room now, their tall silhouettes blocking the windows, their heads tilting in eerie synchronization as they watched. The woman from the photographs appeared at the base of the stairs, her movements jerky, glitching like broken footage. She lifted one trembling arm and pointed toward the sewing room upstairs. My body slid across the floor as invisible hands pulled me toward her. No, please, don't. But the silence swallowed every word. They dragged me into the sewing room, the light flickering overhead. The mannequin stood by the machine again, dress unfinished, needle gleaming. The woman stood beside the mannequin, her head twitching, jaw hanging open. She raised one hand to her face and dug her nails into her own cheek, peeling it downward in a wet tear. Beneath her skin was smooth blankness. Mannequin porcelain. She wasn't the original. They had taken her too. I was shoved into the chair before the sewing machine, my wrists pinned to the armrests by cold, invisible hands. One of the mannequins leaned close, its blank face inches from mine. I felt its breath, a dry, hollow rush of air, brush across my cheek. The woman picked up a needle, a long silver sewing needle. She raised it toward my face. My scream died in my throat. She pressed the needle near my temple. The silence tightened around me like a noose. Then, a sound broke through. A distant car horn, my aunt's. Headlights swept the driveway outside. The mannequin figures froze. The woman jerked, twisting her head toward the window. The hands holding me vanished instantly, dropping me forward. I hit the floor hard. The room exploded into chaos. Mannequin legs scraped backward. Shapes flickered out of existence. The woman let out a shrill, inhuman hiss and dissolved into thin white dust that drifted upward like smoke. The house groaned. The silence collapsed. And for the first time since I'd arrived, the house made noise. Loud, violent noise. Walls shaking, furniture rattling, floorboards buckling. I crawled toward the door on numb hands and knees as the sewing machine clattered to the ground behind me. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly tumbling, as the walls throbbed with a deep, pulsing hum. My aunt burst through the front door, shouting my name. I crashed into her arms, gasping, sobbing, shaking so violently I couldn't form words. She dragged me outside just as the entire house fell silent again. Then the front door slammed shut, hard. My aunt turned pale.
What happened?
She whispered. I couldn't answer. I didn't have to. We heard footsteps inside the house, dozens of footsteps. Then the radio clicked on. A woman's whisper drifted out through the crack beneath the door.
You weren't supposed to leave.
The police arrived. They searched the house. They found nothing. No basement, no photographs, no mannequins, no sewing room. The upstairs room was bare, stripped down to wooden floors and an empty window. My aunt swore it had been furnished when she inherited it, swore that whoever lived there before must have cleared it out. But the dust patterns made no sense. The floor looked untouched for decades. The officers asked questions I couldn't answer. What exactly happened? Why I looked like I'd run through broken glass? Why my hands shook uncontrollably? I told them the truth. They didn't believe a word. Who would? My aunt drove me back to my apartment, her face pale and stiff, hands shaking on the wheel. She hasn't asked me to house sit since. I haven't stepped foot near Grapevine Road again. But sometimes, late at night, when the world grows quiet and still, I hear things. A soft tap, a quiet whisper, a gentle click of a tuning dial somewhere in the dark. And sometimes, when I pass a storefront window or bathroom mirror, I see something move behind me. A tall, faceless silhouette. A porcelain hand with too many joints. A figure that tilts its head at an angle bones aren't meant to bend. I shut the curtains. I keep the lights on. I try not to look too long into any reflective surface, because if I do, if I look too closely, I know the silence will find me again. And the house at the edge of Grey Pine Road doesn't forget its unfinished work. Not ever.
The Hollow Guest.
I never used to believe that a place could watch you. I believed people could watch you. Animals, cameras, predators, stalkers, creeps lurking in the dark with intentions that leak like oil. But the idea that a location itself could behave like a living, breathing organism, that walls could listen, that floors could inhale, that door frames could tense the way muscles do before a sudden movement, never once crossed my mind until the night of Halloween, when I found myself invited to a house I had never heard of, in a neighborhood that didn't technically exist. The invitation came as a letter, not an email, not a text. A physical letter in my mailbox, sealed with thick black wax, stamped with the vague outline of a face, long, thin, featureless. A hollowed face. Inside was a short message. A gathering will be held for those who've been watched. Come. You are expected. I assumed it was a prank, maybe a Halloween-themed party someone from work cooked up, though why they'd involve wax seals and cryptic paper notes, I couldn't guess. Still, the address was printed at the bottom of the page, 109 Hollow Crest Lane. I looked it up. Nothing came up on maps, no street view, no listing, no references. The only result was a single forum post from 2014 titled, "Does Hollow Crest still show up for you guys?" with no replies. I should have taken the hint, but I'm a curious person, more curious than cautious, and curiosity has a way of putting you exactly where you should never be. And so, at around 9 p.m. on Halloween night, I got in my car and drove. Though the GPS refused to acknowledge the address, somehow my car seemed to know where to go. I'd take a turn without thinking, like muscle memory guiding me somewhere I had never been. The road narrowed into asphalt barely wide enough for one vehicle, lined with trees pressed so tightly together that it felt like driving through a gateway meant for someone else. Eventually, after 15 solid minutes of silence, no cars, no houses, no streetlights, I emerged into a cul-de-sac that did not appear on any map. In its center stood a house. A tall, sharp-roofed Victorian relic with windows like staring eyes. No other homes. Just one towering building and a road that ended abruptly behind it, as though the world itself stopped there. A dim orange glow pulsed behind its curtains. Not steady, like a heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the gravel driveway. Crunching stones echoed much louder than they should have. The air was still, too still. Not even the wind dared to breathe. There were no other cars. And yet, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was not the first to arrive. The moment I stepped out of my car, the house seemed to angle itself toward me, as if adjusting posture. I felt eyes on my back, not from any person, but from the structure itself. Its roof joints creaked. The wooden siding settled with a low groan. The windows vibrated faintly like teeth chattering behind a closed jaw. I took a step toward the porch. The house exhaled. Warm air brushed my face. I froze. That wasn't the wind. It couldn't have been. The air was too focused, as if blown from lungs directly onto my skin. But before I could turn around, the porch light flickered on with a dull yellow glow, illuminating a door already cracked open. They were expecting me, whoever they were. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old books, layered with something sweet, rotting sugar like candy left in a damp place until it ferments. The carpet beneath my feet was soft, too soft, as though it had swollen with moisture or something underneath it had begun to rot. "Hello," I called. My voice echoed in a way that didn't match the size of the foyer. It bounced back deeper, as if someone repeated it in a lower tone. I stepped forward, peering around the dim entryway. That's when I saw them. People. 10 or 12 of them, standing perfectly still in the main living room. They weren't talking. They weren't facing each other. They simply stood like mannequins arranged without purpose, staring at nothing. I hesitated. Is this the gathering? None of them reacted. Not a single head turned. Not a blink. I stepped closer, my heartbeat loud in my ears. They were dressed normally. Hoodies, jackets, jeans, sweaters. Some were older, some younger men and women, but something was wrong with their posture. Their spines arched too sharply, as if they were leaning forward in anticipation. Their heads were tilted at uncomfortable angles, ears angled toward the hallway that extended deeper into the house. They were listening. "Hey," I whispered, stepping close to a woman with long auburn hair. Her eyes were open too wide, dry, unfocused. Her jaw hung slack, as though she had forgotten how to close it. I touched her shoulder. Her entire body twitched violently, then froze again. Her head snapped toward the hallway. I followed her gaze. The hallway stretched far longer than the exterior of the house should have allowed. Narrow, dark, lined with doors on each side. The light inside was a strange, shifting color, like illumination through stained glass that changed depending on where you looked. I turned back to the unmoving people. They were all staring at the hallway now, every single one. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered. The woman beside me answered in a voice that sounded scraped raw.
"It wants us to follow."
She didn't blink, didn't look at me, just stared at that impossible hallway. Before I could ask another question, a chime rang out, 3 bell-like tones that vibrated through the floorboards. The group moved instantly, shuffling forward in slow, jerking steps, as if puppeteered by invisible strings their feet dragged. Some wheezed. One man whimpered softly as he moved. Against all common sense, I followed them. The hallway lights dimmed as we approached. The wallpaper looked stained, brownish patches like old water damage, but in shapes too deliberate, like silhouettes pressed outward from behind the walls. As we walked, the house's exhalations grew stronger, warmer, more rhythmic, like breath, like anticipation. We reached the first door. It swung open before anyone touched it. Inside was a small room lit by a single light bulb swinging slightly, though there was no draft. The walls were painted a deep, suffocating red, and in the center was a chair with restraints on the arms. A figure sat in it, a man, dressed in a suit. Motionless. At first I thought he was dead. His head slumped forward. His hands lay limp. His chest didn't move. Then he inhaled sharply, snapping upright with eyes wide open. His pupils were blown out entirely, pure black. He spoke in 3 voices at once, a layered, discordant chorus.
"The first one watches."
Everyone around me stiffened. The man in the chair raised a shaking hand and pointed directly at me.
"You will see it."
The lights flickered violently. The bulb burst. Darkness. Screams. Hands grabbing my jacket, shoving, pulling. When the light returned, the room was empty. The chair was gone. The group was gone. The hallway behind me was gone. I was in an entirely different room, a bedroom, cracked wallpaper, a sagging bed frame, a mirror with a fractured surface. The air was cold, unnaturally so, like standing inside a freezer. Frost coated the window even though it hadn't been cold outside. I backed up, trying to steady my breathing. The mirror across the room shifted. Not the reflection, the mirror itself. A bulge formed beneath the glass, like something pressed its face into it from behind. I watched in horror as the shape of a forehead appeared, followed by empty eye sockets and a long, stretched mouth. Then it whispered, muffled,
You will see me.
The glass cracked in a perfect circle. A hand, pale, impossibly thin, slid through the opening. I stumbled backward, hitting the bed. The hand clawed downward, gripping the edge of the mirror frame. Another crack splintered outward. A shoulder forced its way through, skin stretching as though forced through a too tight opening. The creature had no eyes, only hollow sockets that dripped something thick and black. I scrambled to the door. It was jammed. The creature emerged fully now, its body bending wrong, limbs too long, joints reversed, moving like a puppet missing half its strings. It stepped toward me, head tilted, sniffing. I slammed my shoulder into the door again. It opened inward. I fell into another hallway, shorter this time. The creature's fingers scraped along the floor behind me, making a sharp, chittering sound like nails on bone. I ran. Doors flashed past me on both sides. Each one rattled as something inside pounded to be let out. At the end of the hall was a staircase spiraling downward. I didn't think, I just moved. The stairs creaked under my weight, then started to sway side to side, as though suspended from ropes instead of built into a frame. I grabbed the railing for balance, but it was wet, slick with some kind of thick, amber-colored liquid. I kept going, gagging. The creature followed above, its movements spider-like now, clambering down the wall rather than the stairs. I reached the bottom. Only one door waited there. It opened. The basement was enormous, far too large to fit under a house. It stretched into darkness, lit only by flickering lanterns on both sides. The air smelled like mold and something metallic. Blood, maybe. The walls were stone, old, ancient-seeming. The floors dipped unevenly, engraved with patterns I didn't recognize. And then I saw them, the others, the guests. Dozens of them. All kneeling in rows facing a stone altar. Atop the altar sat the man from the chair, slumped, motionless again. Behind him was a tall figure draped in what looked like a veil made of skin. Its elongated arms stretched toward the ceiling, ending in dozens of finger-like tendrils that curled and swayed as though sensing the air. Its head was long and smooth, with no features at all. A hollow face. The same symbol from the wax seal. It turned toward me without eyes, without any face at all. But I felt its attention crush me like gravity. The creature from the mirror entered behind me. It crawled to the altar and knelt. The veiled figure spoke without opening a mouth.
A new one has been chosen.
The kneeling guests whispered in unison,
A hollow guest.
My chest tightened. I stepped backward, but tendrils extended from the altar, slithering across the floor like serpents. One wrapped around my ankle, another around my wrist. A third coiled around my throat, not tightening, but holding. The veiled creature approached me slowly, its movements elegant yet inhuman. It stopped inches from my face, its featureless head lowering toward me.
You were watched.
It whispered directly into my mind.
Now, you will watch.
I screamed, fighting the tendrils. My vision blurred. A burning sensation flooded my eyes, sharp, icy pain that made me gasp. I felt something drip from them, something warm. Blood. The kneeling crowd leaned forward, swaying, whispering,
It sees. It sees. It sees.
The veiled figure pressed its head to mine. Cold, ancient, devouring. Suddenly the basement shook violently. The lanterns burst, plunging everything into darkness. The tendrils loosened. The whispers grew frantic. I ran. I don't remember how. I don't remember where. I only recall corridors folding in on themselves, rooms looping, doorways swallowing each other. the walls growing tighter, pulsing like something alive. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs trembled. The house tried to mislead me, twisting and shifting its interior. But something guided me, some instinct or force that the creature had mistakenly awakened in me. Finally, I found the front door. It was open. I sprinted into the cold night air, collapsing onto the gravel driveway. The house didn't chase me. It simply watched, settling back into its stillness, porch light blinking once like a slow wink. I didn't look back again. I drove home blind with panic, went straight to the bathroom, washed my face, scrubbed until my skin burned. Only when I dared look into the mirror did I see the truth. My reflection didn't move. Not until a moment later, when it tilted its head in the exact way the veiled creature had. And then it whispered, in the same layered chorus,
You see me now.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Eerie Archives channel. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment what you'd like to see in the next video. Until next time, stay eerie.